you see, the African continent
well because they
has got
believe they can
limited
point out.
financial capacity to tackle
Your
the
attitude-
debt and climate crisis. We're currently facing cyclones, droughts, locust waves, and these are largely bedeviling the Southern Africa region, the East and Horn of Africa, where you see countries such as Zimbabwe, Mozambique, Zambia, Eritrea, Somalia facing challenges, and their challenges are also tied to the debt crisis. And this is also within or amidst the challenging poly crisis that countries in the global south are facing. High levels of debt services or debt servicing are impeding crisis responses and contributing to worsening development prospects for many low-income countries in Africa. This also threatens the ability of countries to adapt to the impending climate crisis and to achieve the SDGs. And you realize, like, both the IMF and the World Bank have developed initiatives for linking debt relief with green, resilient, and inclusive development. I think we've heard of the GREED, the World Bank Evolution Roadmap. The IMF is now into climate policy through the Resilience and Sustainability Trust. And also countries that control these institutions also came up with that G20 common framework, which colleagues are speaking about. You see, at least 23 of 72 countries identified by the UNDP as being at high risk of external debt distress were not covered by the G20 Common Framework. And most of them are actually middle-income countries with large populations. Hinged to this kind of structure that we see as problematic, you know, the unequal and undemocratic financial governance system within the global financial architecture has made that common framework not resolve or fail to resolve the debt crisis. The common framework has failed to deal with the complexities of contemporary debt restructuring by making the debt restructuring process inadequate, exclusionary, protracted, and costly, and we can draw from the Zambian experience. Criticisms also center on its limited scope, as it primarily targets countries eligible for or under the IMF's debt sustainability framework, whilst including the middle-income countries that I've spoken about. Furthermore, the framework has failed to adequately incentivize participation for major creditors, including private lenders and China, which has created a first-mover problem leading to fragmented debt resolution efforts. So one of the most worrying concern with the framework is that it has got a conditional approach of case-by-case debt treatment, and this raises concerns about impeding countries' ability to address immediate needs, such as those related to climate resilience. And this can be exemplified by how restructuring processes involved budgetary adjustments to potentially affect public spending on critical sectors that include environment and climate change, health, education, and infrastructure. These factors have led several African countries to refrain from seeking restructuring through the common framework, opting instead for self-imposed austerity measures that are detrimental to the realization of rights. Mind you, at the moment, we are in the Brazilian presidents of the G20, and G20 finance ministers and central bank governors have been gathering for the various G20 finance track ministerial meetings under the Brazilian presidency to address global economic, fiscal, and monetary issues. But updates I'm getting from colleagues within the G20 engagement groups, where I'm also a co-facilitator on the C20 working group on just, inclusive, and anti-racist economies, shows that the reform agenda, whilst key, is being fought viciously by some countries. And this is concerning, as some countries remain comfortable with the unequal structure that obtains within the Bretton Woods institutions. I think for now, I'll rest my case here.
Yes.
And then I engage in the following questions.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Adrian. And again, apparently, austerity is one of the main playing a key role in this discussion today. And on here, I want to go to Mr. Jawala. Jawala, I also want to hear your experience from the Caribbean countries, and I'm glad that we are having very powerful interventions and colleagues from the Global South. Jawala.
Thank you very much, Shireen. Just to set the context for Caribbean countries, currently we have 6 Caribbean countries that are amongst the top 10 most heavily indebted SIDS worldwide. And in that we have two of the biggest usual suspects in Barbados and Suriname, where debt to GDP ratios at the end of 2023 is somewhere around 125% of GDP. And then we have another 4 countries where their debt to GDP ratios are all beyond 80% of GDP. So what this suggests is that we're not dealing with a liquidity issue here. We are actually dealing with a solvency challenge. And therefore, it is far greater than simply talking about, debt restructuring. So apart from the fact that these 6 countries have solvency issues, we have another 6 whose debt to GDP ratios are somewhere between 60 to 80% of GDP. So in the words of the fund, that suggests that at a medium term or medium high risk of debt distress. And if we look at the debt servicing profile for these countries, they generally on average are using about 15% of revenues to service debt. And we know well what that means in terms of the diversion of resources in terms of dealing with climate change, dealing with health and education. To come into the fact that this is interlinked with climate change is that a major factor that has contributed to this debt buildup in the Caribbean is that we've had to deal with some very powerful and destructive hurricanes. And in the face of those hurricanes, Caribbean governments, again, with this limited fiscal space, they've had no choice but to borrow and borrow heavily on the international market. And that has raised the debt. And while that has happened, the credit rating agencies have come in and said, well, your debt stock is too high. It's due to climate change. So there's a climate risk premium now being built inside the borrowing structure. And that again is leading to an increased cost of borrowing, again, raising debt. So we're inside this vicious debt climate trap. And because Caribbean countries are middle-income countries, they are not eligible for the typical debt relief initiatives that we've seen, whether it's HIPC, whether it's multilateral debt relief initiative, or now whether it's the common framework. So let me come to the common framework now, and in the context of the Caribbean. First, Caribbean countries are not eligible for the common framework. So it's not common to start with. Right? Second, many of the issues around the common framework are common to the Caribbean. China, for instance, is the single largest bilateral creditor in the Caribbean. Private creditors account for 30% of the region's external debt. So these are 2 major creditor players that have to be treated with. And yet inside the common framework, it's very difficult to get them to come in. The second is that when you look at the common framework, what it has done is that it has delayed restructuring. On average, it has taken 3 years to get to a point where a restructuring could take place. And even when the restructuring happens, it is what I call kicking the can down the road. Right? So it's not really dealing with the immediate issue, right, that's facing the country. And that in itself is the experience of Caribbean countries without even having to get inside the common framework. Over the last 20 years, there has been, on average, a debt restructuring episode per year in the Caribbean. The latest is actually Suriname, which started a debt restructuring episode more than 3 years ago. Has reached some agreement with creditors, but that has not been finalized as yet. Right? So that again shows you, even without the common framework, how difficult it is. And why it is at the end of the day, I think we need to acknowledge that the common framework has failed. Let's stop trying to fix something that was broken from the beginning. Right? So.
Thanks a lot, Joella. That tells us a lot about our reality from the Global South. And as well as debt restructuring, we see other emerging proposals. including, as we mentioned earlier, climate resilience debt clauses and debt for climate, debt for nature swaps. So let's start with the swaps then. And in that, I will go to Mark's because I want to know. I know that the IMF has already been engaging in the conversation around debt swaps, including those involving private sectors. And I want to know, I want you to tell us more about the potential benefits from that the fund sees in this proposal or arrangements. The floor is yours.
Thank you. I think swaps have been around for a while, since the 1980s. They remain sort of a niche instrument. They never gained much scale, but there has been a few very high-profile transactions lately that did involve quite sizable amounts. I think in a nutshell, the idea is that you exchange a debt claim for a commitment to undertake some expenditure, and it typically has been the case in nature, but it could be for climate, it could be for health expenditure. So the Global Fund has actually facilitated a number of bilateral swaps in health. So it can be any development-related goal. And then the idea is that the amount that you would have otherwise used to service a debt, you would use to cover this expenditure. So the simplest type of swap would involve the donor having a direct claim on the country that it could write it down. This sort of coincidence is rare. So typically the large, especially for the large transactions that we have seen, it involved the country buying back private sector debt. And the way the transaction was structured, so we would have someone like, say, TNC facilitating the transaction and getting together with an official creditor or participant to provide a guarantee. So, for example, the U.S. Development Finance Corporation or the IDB, to provide a credit enhancement that would allow the new bond, for example, the blue bond issued in the case of Belize, or the Galapagos bond in the case of Ecuador, to be issued at a much more favorable terms than the country would be able to borrow in the absence of the guarantee. So maybe in an ideal world, the fact that it is a blue bond that has this conservation commitment would allow it to be issued at more favorable terms. But I think in practice, the bulk of the difference in terms is coming from the guarantee that is being provided on the bond. So you issue this bond at a much more favorable rate, you buy down the more expensive debt, and you use part of the savings to meet your commitment to a conservation project. So it can be the savings can be sizable. In the case of Ecuador, for example, they bought that at a 60% discount. So they were able to buy about $1.6 billion worth of that. With the guaranteed bond. So they are gaining scale, so they can be large, but the constraint is that for this transaction to work, you have to sort of jump through all these financial hoops in the hope of saving the money at the end of the day. But I think a key constraint is that you need someone to provide this guarantee, this credit enhancement for the bond. And I think it's also something that you need to take into account, that if the country ever facing this future situation where it needs to restructure, that it would have this bond with the guarantee could add a bit of a complication in that case. So we need to always be careful and take into account all the costs, both the monetary costs and the costs that may come through the change in your debt composition. But there is a template out there. There are many successful cases that can be followed, and this is something that could potentially, if it gets scaled, they could start to have more of an impact, because so far, even though the transactions are sizable, they're still maybe nowhere near the size of the climate financing that needs to be done.
Thanks, Marcus, for sharing more information. And that doesn't mean I agree, but I have to go. I have to go. I still have to be here. And on that, I want to go to Mariana. Well, it's important for us all to know what is the proposals and how also we see and evaluate those proposals and to interact with them. And it's important also for us from the Global South to be there on the table and to share our own proposals also that can suit and can benefit us from the global south and not to add on our debt burden. So from the proposals that already there, Mariana, I'll go to Mariana because you are a part of the debt relief for green and inclusive recovery project, which suggests a private creditor debt swap, right? So I want to know how that different, how this proposal is different from the debt for climate swap, and what is, or how do you see the benefits from this? Over to you.
So I think there is now a building consensus that debt for nature swaps are much more a debt management process than a debt relief effort. They are often suggested when countries are not through a process of debt restructuring. There are some numbers provided by UNCTAD recently that, as you already mentioned, debt swaps are not new. Overall, there was 230 swaps that has been identified by UNCTAD in the nominal amount of 11 billion. But the amount of actually savings that it provides is marginal. And so it's not really a tool to support that relief process. It's much more, and I think this is something that has been discussed within the Global Debt Sovereign Roundtable. I think that is a building consensus. It's not a tool for debt relief. It's a tool, it's something else. What we have proposed in the debt relief for green inclusive recovery is that, well, recognizing that today we have a very complex debt landscape with official creditors, with bondholders, with China, how can we actually not only facilitate the debt restructuring process and make sure that all creditors are participating? So how do we create instruments to all creditors to participate? I think for bilateral official creditors is quite straightforward. There are reduction of net present value by extending the debt or by providing, nominal haircut. But when it goes to bondholders, and I think this is also something that can bring China, a commercial creditor, into the negotiation table. So our proposal is that the credit from bondholders or commercial creditors, they would provide a deep debt relief for developing countries, but in exchange for this deep debt relief, they would have a guarantee that the debt would be paid. Because what you're seeing today is that we are having very shallow deals, and the probability of countries getting that distress again is very high. And this means that all creditors, they're going to get in another debt negotiation and they are going to lose money again. So how can we make actually, can we avoid the too little, too late, right? Can we do it not only faster? That has been the discussion within the Global Sovereign Debt Table, Roundtable now, but also make it deeper. So the idea is that it would be a post-restructuring arrangement, not a pre-restructuring arrangement as the swap agreements. It will have deeper haircuts, and the old debt would be switched by a new debt that is with much lower, can be reduction of the present of the nominal value, can be reduction of the interest rate moving forward. This is something that resonates with early proposals from the Bretton bond proposals. So this is something that has been tested. It has helped countries in Latin America to reduce the burden and also had access to capital. So this is something that can, support bondholders, entice bondholders to participate. Of course, this is not going to solve by itself. We need sticks as well. We have colleagues from Jubilee USA maybe here today. They are working on the reform of the New York legislation, which is also key. So it's a combination. It has to be everything together. And just a few questions, a few points on how it actually can also help solving the question of commercial creditors from China. So if you look back to the 1990s and 1980s, the Bretton bond plan was involving commercial creditors, banks from the US, right? So they exchange the claims from the banks for bonds. So what you're proposing here, lending from commercial banks from China is also very bank-led, right? We have Exim Bank, we have China Development Bank. The proposal would be to take these loans that has the chance to recover these loans are very low. They would be removed from the balance sheets of these institutions. They would be securitized at the end, and will be transformed in a bond that could circulate in markets and actually support the more assets in the market. So I think this is a proposal that would provide more debt relief. It will be a better proposal not only for the debtor country, but also to the creditor, because they would have the guarantee to be repaid in the long term. So this is the key differences that we see compared to swap agreements.
Thanks a lot on illustrating more on that. And I want to hear from Adrian, to share with us your views from an African perspective. Adrian, the floor is yours.
Thanks. So you see, I'm glad our colleague from the IMF has even highlighted that debt swaps are not a new phenomenon, but there is a lot of pomp around them and how UN agencies, international NGOs, as well as government are looking towards them as if they are like some silver bullet of some sort. Look, debt swaps, in as much as in Africa, I know there is the case of the Seychelles, Gabon, and recently when I was in Malawi, the Treasury Permanent Secretary spoke about a swap they were negotiating. But there might be not a lot of information around the African perspectives, but we do take cues from what we have seen from critical analysis of debt swaps from Belize, as well as from Ecuador. And one thing that is coming out is that debt swaps will not provide substantial debt reduction, nor will they create sufficient fiscal space for global south countries to tackle the development and climate change challenges. You see, and I take or reference a study done by one of our colleagues, Yolanda Fresnillo from Eurodad, where she highlights that debt swaps are not an effective instrument for reducing debt levels in a meaningful way. And taking from the fact that they have been there since the 80s, she highlights that, over the 3 decades of debt swaps, they've only led to roughly US 8.4 billion in debt treated, which is basically 0.11% of total debt payments by low and middle income countries during the same period. So this basically means that debt swaps are not a means to restore the sustainability and cannot substitute, or is not a way to avoid a comprehensive debt restructuring, including, the need for debt cancellation. They are also hinged to conditionality. Debt swaps will not happen if the debtor countries does not agree to invest in freed up resources in the area or project to be approved by the creditor. This entails a risk that they will be used by creditors to impose their own interests and priorities over those of the borrowing countries. This is something that is also happening within the realm of aid tying. We see that happening, and it's very problematic because the priorities that are then taken are not the borrower country priorities, but rather the creditors. Almost similar to the common framework, swaps tend to be very slow, complex, and very costly as well. And this basically entails or means the multiplication of transaction and management costs, and it could be problematic for countries that are already in debt. Coming from civil society, one thing that a number of researchers on Belize, Ecuador, as well as Gabon, there are highlights that there is limited community and civil society participation. And, in as much as there has been some form of inclusion of citizens, civil society, local entities from both the lender and borrowing countries, it has not always been the case, and to some degree, it hasn't been meaningful to the degree that would entail that there is some inclusion, and it feels to some degree like a tick box exercise. So I think in just rounding up, the progress and pumped up focus on debt swaps must not be an excuse to detract attention from the urgent need that we need for the reform of the international debt architecture. And I think the cue is on global north countries, the Bretton Woods institutions, to ensure that they shift. There is a need for a substantial shift from the current status quo that we're seeing, because it would basically be trying to greenwash and things like that. But yeah, I think those would be my submissions for the meantime. Thanks, and over.
Thanks, Adriana, and we will take on this more. But now on climate resilient debt clauses, I want to go to Jawala. Mr. Jawala, the Prime Minister of Barbados, Maya Motley, has been calling for these types of clauses on loan contracts for some time. So can you please tell us more a bit about them, and what is your views, your personal views on also those callings, and do you think it is in relation of the debt crisis, but do you think it's valuable solutions?
All right. Thanks, Shireen. Before I tackle the debt pause clauses, could I just give a quick comment on the debt swap?
Sure.
Yeah, and that is really in relation to Belize debt swap, which has in the literature been held up as a success story, and really, I mean, that's something I think is questionable. Why is it a success story? First, Belize is a known serial defaulter. Belize loves to default on its debt. The fact that this particular Eurobond was one of the super bonds, I think this was the third time it was actually going to be defaulting on a super bond, right? And that super bond was traded in the market at a considerable discount, which then made it far easier, because the markets just said, look, we really don't think that this country is going to come back at a point where it could actually repay, right, this debt. And therefore, at that considerable discount, it actually made sense to go into the market and buy back the debt, right? Even when that had happened, Belize is the only debt swap case where there has been a debt stock reduction, simply because where that debt was traded in the market, right? And because that was private sector debt. Even when you look at the debt swap deal, there are many, many questions, particularly around the fact that the government itself now has no control and no influence over the special purpose vehicle that was set up to look after the marine protected areas, right? Because the government, for instance, has nobody sitting on the board of that SPV. And if you go into details, right, the devil is in the details. You look at the agreements on the marine protected areas, you actually find that if the government slips up and doesn't meet those particular targets, then it's going to have to pay back money, right? So let's put that aside. Let's go to the debt pause clauses. And first, these were actually pioneered by Grenada in 2015 when it undertook its debt restructuring, because Grenada, almost a decade back, had come out from Hurricane Ivan, which had devastated the country to the point of 100% of GDP. Right? So that was a massive loss for Grenada. And even during that decade, it was still trying to find its way. It had lost significant development. So Grenada went and decided in its Paris Club debt restructuring, and even with some of the Eurobond creditors, to put in these debt pause clauses. Barbados saw the fact that this made sense, and during its 2018 to 2019 debt restructuring exercises, put in these debt pause clauses. And Prime Minister Maya Motley, in championing the Bridgetown initiative, spoke about the need for debt pause clauses, what we now call in climate resilient debt clauses. And at the Paris summit, there was this major announcement by the incoming president of the World Bank that the World Bank would now consider putting these into bond contracts. And then an announcement was made more recently, it would be both existing and current contracts. So the advantage of the debt pause clause is that it gives a country temporary breathing space in the event a natural disaster hits, so that you don't have to take debt servicing payments and service debt. You know, could take that and use that for relief. And why is that too important? Because in the Caribbean, we actually saw when Hurricane Irma hit Barbuda, Antigua had to make a payment almost a month after to the IMF. And yeah, there was no recourse. You have to pay it, right? Even the fact that the sister island of Barbuda was completely devastated. So the need to have some sort of mechanism to deal with debt suspension is critically important. But there's an issue too around a market issue around debt pause clauses, because no one has worked out yet what then becomes the risk premium, the credit risk premium for temporarily suspending your debt service payment. Because remember, all you're doing is suspending. Eventually, you're going to have to repay that plus the accumulated interest at some point in time. But the market up front will already start to price in, you have a debt pause clause, right? What is that risk premium? And that's why an alternative is actually parametric insurance for sovereign debt. Strange enough, Belize actually did that during its debt swap deal, right? When it issued the blue bond, it actually got parametric insurance from the Development Finance Corporation, the US DFC, where it insured, right, the debt service and payment. So automatically, if a natural disaster hits, the insurance payment kicks in and the debt servicing is made. So now we have the issue. Which one is costlier? The credit risk premium built into a debt pause clause or the parametric insurance costs for sovereign debt? I'll leave it there.
Yes. Thank you, Joel. Actually, we're going to open the floor after surprise. So let me go back on this to Marks and then open the floor. Apparently, there's a lot of questions going to come. So from the IMF, I want to know what is the IMF take on the clauses, and is the IMF considering also including them on its loans with the climate vulnerable countries? And let's put in mind that the climate vulnerable countries number are raising, and the climate vulnerable countries are also under a big debt situation, not only for paying the debt, but also for paying extra charges like surcharges. So over to you.
Sure. I think, we welcome the adoption of these clauses. I think there are a lot of very nice features to them. There's a very strong theoretical case that is like a win-win situation for everyone. For the country, you get hit by a hurricane, it gives some immediate relief to focus on that immediate crisis response. If you're a creditor, you can also make the case that it could be in our collective interest because giving this briefing room to the country could prevent what could otherwise be a restructuring from taking place. So give a bit of briefing room for the country to respond to the crisis and that gets capitalized. And then after the country has recovered, it can then repay you. So it should be, it has the potential to be a win-win. I think there is some resistance on the private sector to this adoption. These clauses were included in the Grenada and Barbados debt restructurings, and then on the Barbados blue bond. But there haven't been, aside from that, at least to my knowledge, no new issuance of bonds with these clauses. There was an effort led by the UK with the official and private sector participants to develop a model clause for these types of bonds. So this effort to sort of standardize and communicate to the creditors and have even discuss with the credit rating agencies, get everyone on board that this is a useful template to use. But this has been out for maybe more than a year, maybe even two, and still no first movers willing to adopt it. We do see a lot of bilateral creditors, including these types of clauses in their loans. I think the UK, France, Canada, if not already adopting, at least seriously looking into adopting them. The US, I'm sure I'm forgetting someone, and even the multilateral development banks have started to include these features. So we see a lot of interest, but still on the bonded debt side, waiting for a first taker for this clauses to be adopted in a new issuance. As far as fund lending goes, I think we are quite agile in our emergency financing. I think we take pride of that we can put together an emergency financing program quite rapidly, like in maybe a month, 2 months. And that probably can give more money up front than the CCRT would, sorry, than the CRDC would, as far as that service of the fund. And we also have the CCRT for most vulnerable members. So there are already part of the toolkit that can replicate and even improve upon what the CRDC could accomplish. But I think that it is an interesting question whether we should include that to give some automaticity. There are some constraints in our lending frameworks and policies which will have to be addressed, but I don't know. I haven't seen any concrete proposals to move this idea forward, but I see that idea being made and some interest on it. But again, we already have a lot of tools that can replicate and even go beyond what the CRDC would do as far as that service of the fund would go.
Thanks a lot, Marcus. And I hope with those tools, other policies also to be maybe reformed. And on that, I will open the floor only for 10 minutes for the sake of the time. So I will only take 3 questions. I know that there's a lot of burning questions in the room. I will take your comment, but promise to be in less than a minute. Please speak in the mic for the people online to be able to hear.
All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Alex Corp. I look after parametric insurance practice at ISI, which is the world's largest satellite operator. And I was absolutely delighted that you mentioned parametric insurance example with Belize, because quite frankly, coming into this conversation, I thought that the notion should be quite simple. And that is, for majority of countries, not for majority, but for many countries, the biggest driver of their credit risk and credit default is actual natural disaster, whether that's a hurricane, whether that's a volcanic eruption, you name it, drought in Africa, you name it, right? And so the great news for all of you guys is that there is this wonderful new world of alternative insurance solutions, and parametric insurance is one of them, global reinsurance market that is chomping at the bit to take on that risk. Now, question is, who pays the premium, who subsidizes the premium? And in fact, to your question, what is cheaper, parametric insurance or the risk premium provided by the financier? You know where my answer would be. You want to place the risk with someone who is specializing in that and who has a globally diversified book. So examples like Belize, eminently replicatable the world over. Parametric insurance is the best thing since sliced bread. And World Bank itself, in fact, announced a couple of months ago that they're going to place a particular effort on embedded parametric solution into financing solutions, like the one that was done for Belize. So it's a great news for everyone. Use this market, please.
Thanks a lot. And I will take 2 more. So we have Yolanda, our colleague here. Yolanda, please start.
Sorry. Thanks a lot. I raised the hand because also the reference to insurance. It's pretty unfair that it should be in the backs of the countries that haven't created the problem for them to pay for insurance themselves for a problem that they haven't created. I know that they are the ones that have the problem, but if anyone should insurance, if climate would be I don't know, prone to be insurance, it should be the global north countries, the ones that have created the problem, the rich in this world, the institutions they owe, like the World Bank and the IMF, not just providing the premium or the resources to reduce that premium, but to pay for the insurances if it is insurable. Sorry about that, but it is unconscionable. I don't know how to say this word. Unconscionable. Yeah. That, yeah, I should pay for my neighbor's risk It's my neighbor who pays for my risk. If it's his, I don't know, toilet that is leaking, right? And that's what we're asking the Global South to pay for our toilet leaking. I don't know, it's out of any logic. But I have a question as well, which is on, sorry, the IMF, yeah. The IMF has an instrument, the CCRT, and it is very limited in the number of countries that is available to. I don't think it's available to any Caribbean country because of not being low income. Yeah, we have been wondering and asking if there is any plan for reviewing the CCRT, for replenishing the CCRT, for using, for instance, SDRs to replenish the CCRT, gold sales to replenish the CCRT. The CCRT provides debt payments cancellation to countries affected by catastrophes, and it could be a good instrument, but it's underused. Dominica, when it was hit by the Hurricane Maria, asked for such an instrument, and it wasn't for them. And yeah, but what I had on debt swaps was already said by Adrian, so thank you. Thanks.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah, so I'm James Keddy, and I work with the Africa Sovereign Debt Justice Network, one of the sponsors of this event. And thank you for the remarks. I just wanted to say on the debt for nature swaps, this week we have filed a case. Kenya is another country that has announced that they are doing debt for nature swaps or panda bonds, whatever, lots of fancy words. And this was announced in the budget policy statement and in the debt strategy that Kenya has. But there's absolutely no information who are the transactional advisors, what costs, what conservation groups they're going to use. They're going to obviously be from the West because obviously they think that indigenous people who have lived in these places don't know how to manage their environment. And I just wanted to say thank many people around the room who have done fantastic work on all the other examples of the debt for nature swaps, which were really important in crafting this case, and to ask for their continued collaboration, because we're simply asking the government to disclose what they're doing each step of the way and to involve the participation of the groups that are likely to be affected by these swaps. So we'll have an event soon. And we'll stream it virtually. And so any of the groups that are doing work in that area obviously would be great collaborators for us.
Thanks a lot. And apparently I'm going to you, Marks.
Sure.
Do we need to pay for the leaking toilets for the north? It's very important. It's very important. It's very important because we are also not responsible on what is happening from the ecological climate crisis that is leading to also ecological crisis. But, and that's we have a question here apparently related to this, but also I need to know your takeaway on the CCRT.
Sure. I don't work directly on the CCRT, but I know that all the fund policies, they are periodically reviewed. So that is certainly a question worth looking into on this review. I think the challenge is that you will need to have the donors provide the resources that would allow for the expansion of the CCRT, both in terms of coverage or generosity of the support. So I think that that's also the constraints that we tend to run into. Maybe a lot of the initiatives, or same for the who would provide the insurance, is that at the end of the day, we need to find a donor to step up, and there are many competing demands on those donors. Mm-hmm. So that in a sense that becomes the key bottleneck, so to speak.
I want to follow on this, because really I cannot take my mind away from the leaking toilet. It's very obvious, and how a high debt burden on many global south countries are also facing a shortage of climate finance from the global north to the global south. And I think it's something that we all agree on, as we can see. But the question here has become, how do we mobilize more climate finance for countries facing the worst impact of the climate crisis? And who did not cause it? As we all know. Do we all know who did not cause it? Us, the global south. I mean, at least we didn't contribute that much. I mean, we are not part of the what is happening in the climate nowadays. I can say it reached out to be a crime. The global warming. I'm coming from. I live in Morocco, and you can feel and touch it. I was sharing with one of our colleagues earlier. You can touch how we are affected by the climate crisis. A country like Morocco, green Morocco, actually, we are depending on producing vegetables and fruits. We can't because you when you pass away, you will see all the rivers, the small rivers or even the dams are dried. So you can touch it. We can touch it. We can see it every day now. So that's why I don't want my daughter to fight over water in the upcoming couple of years. So again, I don't. Of course, you are on the spot because you are a panelist. But could you please start by sharing some of maybe the initiative that the fund is involving in to increase finance to the global south? And to global south countries for climate action, and also what the IMF is doing to mitigate the risk of adding to already overburdened debt levels.
Sure. In terms of financing, the core type of lending that the IMF does is crisis-related lending. So it would tend to, the country has a balance of payments problem. We need to help that adjust. So it needs to adjust, and then the IMF support helps facilitate that adjustment with the goal of restoring the member to become sustainable again in the medium term. With the RST, we do start to provide a bit more of the type of long-term financing that you would normally use to associate with, say, climate adaptation. But those sums are small, like in terms of the quote of the members' quota. I think 100%. I may be mixing the number. So I mean, by all accounts, those climate investment needs are in the order of trillions of dollars. So what the IMF can do directly is small. So which is why it has to be a concerted effort from the entire official community. And to be honest, also the private sector, because the official money alone is not going to cover the ground that needs to be covered. So we have to find ways to also stimulate private investment on that front. In terms of debt sustainability, it's actually a key requirement for fund lending that be sustainable. So we cannot lend into an unsustainable situation because it would only make the problem worse. In fact, maybe even more, possibly much worse, because IMF is a preferred creditor, so you'll just be planning on more senior debt on top of an unsustainable situation, and that's something that we certainly do not want to do. So it's one of our key requirements that be sustainable. If that is not sustainable, then the country needs to adjust. We will help that facilitate the adjustment process. But there are cases where there's no economically or politically feasible adjustment that can restore sustainability. And in those cases, then we do need a debt restructuring before we can provide the support.
Thank you, Marcus. I want also to hear from our colleagues from the Global South in the panel. I will go to Adrian. Adrian, what is your take on those initiatives and their potential impact on debt levels in the African context? And what is the alternative or are the alternatives that do you see for mobilizing climate finance? Adrian, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Shireen. So look, we have seen institutions such as the World Bank coming up with or promoting the use of blended finance, de-risking instruments, the use of PPPs, etc., through the cascade approach, maximizing financing for development, the grid. But also there is this, I would call it seemingly hot cakes in the name of just energy transition partnerships. I think for the case of South Africa, it clinched an $8.5 billion JETP financing deal with the governments of France, Germany, the UK, the US, as well as the European Union. At that point, at COP26, it was 8.5. Around December last year, it was around 9.3, 9.7 billion. But the aim rather is to deal or support rather the implementation of South Africa's revised NDCs, nationally determined contributions. It is a mix of commercial loans, 63%, concessional loans, 18%, grants, 4%, and guarantees, 15%. But what's key to mention here is that this JETP prioritizes, blended finance and PPPs through independent power producers. And some of the negative implications is that it commits the state to de-risking private investment. And this approach has a number of risks, if I should say, right? Because one, the state assumes the majority of the commercial risk, providing sovereign guarantees for much of the debt. And this model as well subsidizes the cost of capital for IPPs, the independent power producers, and further encourages them to take on greater risk and engage in short-term speculative activity in financial markets to secure additional sources of profit. So it's more like, government supporting profit making of private companies, yet the public, which is the citizens, get to suffer. It is, in terms of also negative implications, likely to deepen the energy poverty through increasing energy prices. And this is because the state utility, in this case ESCOM, is locked into high tariffs, irrespective of the falling cost of renewable energy production. And it is also obliged, that is the country, to purchase a minimum amount of electricity from these IPPs. So you see the risks that the country is taking basically speak or translate to the debt it would need to pay, in as much as there is that cost utility where citizens or the public have to pay for the service. There are some challenges there. I'm particularly worried as well because, look, the just energy transition has got negative consequences for workers. No doubt we need to move from fossil fuels to renewables, but it's also worrying. I think in the last year or two, the IMF issued a paper arguing for weakening labor protections to improve efficiency of green transitions. And this is something that's very worrying. But when we are to look at the alternatives themselves, when we are to look at the alternatives themselves, I think there are various proposals that are being made that fall within monetary policy, fiscal, the role of MDBs, as well as even regulating private lenders. But I'll just speak to the fiscal aspect of things. I think there is one area of raising or resourcing for climate finance that is being touted at the moment, taxing the rich as well as financial transaction taxes. I think FTTs are one of the few sources of financing that can, if designed properly, provide sufficient funding to address the growing challenges of climate change, as well as contribute to national budgets. A number of studies have been done. I think the Austrian Institute for Economic Research at some point did their research, and they noted that a global transaction tax of 0.1% could yield between 410 and $1 trillion. I don't know if this still stands, because I think the study was done some years ago, about 6 years ago. And the North-South Institute estimated that a levy of at least 0.005% on currency transactions on all major currencies in dealer markets could yield at least $33 billion. these funds combined could, and it actually beyond the 100 billion commitment that was made at COP15 that developed countries are failing to meet year on year. At the IEJ, we also have a body of work on wealth taxes and FTTs vis-a-vis resources mobilization. But since it is research that is being currently developed, it would be unethical, at least for me, to use raw evidence. But the exemplars that we are seeing are depicting almost a similar trend. So basically, that's how I see and view things with regards to alternatives as well. Thanks, and over.
Thanks a lot, Adrian. And I also want to within the same context, I want to hear from you, Jawala. How do you see those initiatives that the IMF put on the table, and what is the alternatives that you see can actually mobilize more resources for climate finance?
All right, sure. First, let's just look at the estimated gross climate financing needs of the Caribbean. That is at a minimum is about 30% of the region's GDP by 2030. So clearly, the Caribbean countries don't have fiscal space to finance out their climate plans. And even if they had to finance that through debt, clearly this is going to put us in an even more serious situation. So we've got to find a way of how do you finance your climate ambitions without unduly raising debt. We've been talking now around a few solutions: parametric insurance, debt swaps, debt restructuring. And the region has been calling for concessional financing, and the IMF, in a sense, has responded commendably through the Resilience and Sustainability Trust, which is the first instrument to provide concessional financing for key structural challenges, of which climate change is one. There are two countries that have gone under RSF arrangements in the Caribbean, Barbados and Jamaica. And a key part of the IMF's RSF programming is that it invokes the catalytic nature of financing that is expected to come from being under a fund program. And that means that if you enter into these fund arrangements, well, the seal of good housekeeping from the IMF means that capital is likely to come flowing in from other players, and particularly in this case, from the private sector. And if we look at Barbados and Jamaica's experience, and this is really the early experience, so this is likely to change, but to the end of last year, December 2023, there was not a single dollar private capital, right? Climate finance flow into these countries. And remember, Barbados is a country run by Mayor Motley, and they haven't gotten $1 of private climate finance. Right? I mean, it's cast no aspersions on our leadership, but it shows you the difficulty, right, of attempting to get this particular player to come to the table. And in the meantime, what has happened is, right, finance has flowed from the multilaterals and the GCF from other players, and debt has gone up. So it's still not in a win-win situation. The expectation is maybe over time, over the next 2 years or so, it's quite likely that the private sector may step in. But at the moment, we have not seen that happen. And it's for that reason why Caribbean civil society has actually developed its own plan, right? And in the region, it's actually called Caribbean Emancipation 2030. It's a plan that's actually based on, again, the Brady Plan and what happened under the HIPC initiative. And it really, in a nutshell, it simply seeks to say, look, we've got to get some form of debt relief, whether that comes from cancellation, restructuring, swaps, whatever, in exchange for climate actions, right? So the region has put forward a proposal, right, to treat with this, how do we get out of the mid-income country debt for climate trap?
Thanks a lot. That was very important. Thanks a lot, Jawala. And exploring some of the proposed solutions to the debt and the climate crisis. I'd love to know from our panelists what from your perspective, what is the specific initiative or solution that you are advocating for this year and beyond to address the debt crisis and ensure countries have the resources they need to respond to the climate crisis? And we heard many suggestions from our colleagues Adrian and Joella. So I want to know what is the IMF priorities on this issue this year.
Sure. On that, we continue to approach on a case-by-case basis when countries are unsustainable, when they come to the fund. We certainly help them adjust through that process. On climate, I think there's quite an active climate-related work by the fund. I tend to work mostly on the debt side of things, but I think climate is an issue that we all now recognize that it has macroeconomic implications, so it has percolated all of the fund's work, be it even our surveillance work, certainly a consideration when even on that, it's starting to be more and more, we are taking into account the implications that climate can have for that sustainability, especially when we look over the long term. So it's certainly like a very active area. And on these issues of debt and climate finance, I think we do have many countries with debt challenges and with climate challenges. There can be some synergies trying to tackle both together, but I think in some cases there also may be a case to proceed on both sides separately, especially when it comes to the debt restructuring cases. There's this fear that otherwise we may risk further complicating what is already a fairly complicated process of getting other creditors on board. But whenever there are synergies to tackling both debt and climate together, we should certainly explore those synergies. And I think that swaps is a tool. I mean, it can only cover so much ground, but whenever those gains can be made, we should explore them.
Thank you, Marcus. Mariana, I want you to tell me if you had to highlight one key priority for decision makers and civil society on addressing the debt crisis, and one also on the lack of climate finance, what would you advocate for?
Okay. Well, I think there are probably a list, but I'll try to narrow down. I think a key aspect is that we need a functional common framework that allows countries that need that relief that they actually can go through without being as painful as it is at this process. But taking the opportunity that we are in the IMF, I think, and the question by Yolanda on the CCRT, I think one key aspect for countries in that distress now and giving further supports to those facing climate shocks. I think the replenishment of the CCRT is key. It has been completely basically emptied because of the COVID crisis and in the last years. The question is how we are going to fund the CCRT. The IMF, just a reminder that the IMF has, from my last accounting on the GOAT, 162 billion on GOATs. In its balance as GOATs. We're not suggesting it's going to be in the markets, it's just repricing of the GOAT. And this could be a low-hanging fruit to support those countries that have facing climate shocks at this moment. There is now the debate on how to do if the GOATs should be used for PRGT, for instance. But I think the tricky of using the GOATs for PRGT is that the PRGT subsidy resources are high because of high interest rate, right? Yes. So using the resources of all members to subsidize the fact a policy decision from advanced countries can be tricky. But if the GOAT is used for CCRT, I think it's a more fair use of of the resources of the fund. Yeah, I went it here. So I think overall we need a better that framework, that restructuring framework. And from the fund point of view, one key aspect would be the CCRT. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Mariana. And I also have the same question to you, Adrian, online. What will be your priority, one key priority for decision makers and also civil society in addressing the debt crisis, and one also on the climate finance? Over to you, Adrian.
You say one, but there are a lot, right? But I think
we know
we ought to be very ambitious. So I think with regards to addressing the debt crisis, the cancellation of odious debts, or basically debt cancellation in retrospect, I think, and this can be coupled with the reform of the international financial architecture, you know, the need for democratic governance within the World Bank and IMF. And if possible, if the politics allow, a new issuance of special drawing rights could bring about liquidity that would be, you know, used towards climate finance. Secondly, and looking at climate finance itself, I think I've spoken about FTTs, but FTTs for the loss and damage fund could raise the much needed climate finance, as opposed to going for the pension funds, etc., that are being touted at the moment. Thanks, and over.
Thanks a lot. You said actually my favorites. Over to you, Joanna.
All right, thanks, Shireen. And because the issues of debt and climate change are actually interlinked, what I would say would be strong political will and strong policy design. And in the context of the Caribbean, I say that because what we've seen is the Caribbean has been strongly advocating, right, for solutions. For example, through AOSIS, the Alliance of Small Island States, for 20 years, as a member of that institution, that group, the Caribbean has been advocating, and eventually we saw the creation of the loss and damage facility. Of course, Yolanda, we asked the Global North to pay for the plumbing, and we've seen how much they've only managed to cough up. So I'm not too sure if we ask them to now pay for parametric insurance, right, to cover for the plumbing, what they will actually give us. But at least I think we know we have an innovative instrument that could be used. Who pays, I think, is another discussion. And I just want to add, to close with that, in the sense that with strong political will and strong policy design, come next month, end of May, we're going to be having what's called the SIDS 4 conference in Antigua. And that is actually the point at which SIDS come together to actually develop another 10-year plan for where they go forward. And at that conference, debt and climate change obviously figures prominently. And there's actually what is now being carried through is something called a debt service support initiative that is likely to form part of that 10-year plan. And that would include what we've been discussing in terms of instruments, but within a risk layering framework, and the fact that reform of the global financial architecture also has to take place. So I end with that.
Thanks a lot. That was very important. And I mean, it looks like a very powerful close to the session, but it's not yet closed. We still have time for our audience interventions, and I don't know if we have an online. Okay, so I will open the floor. I can take 3 quick comments or questions, but before this, I want to say, I know that I'm moderating, so I don't have the right, but I want to say there is a lot can be done in that term, specifically on finance. For climate finance, at least start with issuing new SDRs. That can help a lot. And also I'm asking here, and I will keep asking, to eliminate the unfair policy, the surcharge policy, and a simple solution is cancel the debt. Cancel the illegitimate debt from the fossil fuels investment. Cancel our debt. So, and here I'll open the floor for quick comments. Please go ahead.
Hi, my name is Juliet Adams, and I am from the Caribbean. And so I'll be very quick with my question. Where is the Caribbean single market? Where is that, the status of that? And don't you feel that that would give you leverage in terms of bargaining for your, the debt consolidation, release, etc.? Thank you.
Thank you. Any other comment or question? Okay.
As far as I know, the Caribbean single market is still in the Caribbean, right? Hasn't moved. But that itself is a process that has not really lived up to expectations. And it is not one that, in the context of civil society and where we've been advocating and treating for debt and climate finance, that has featured prominently. Because it's still a really more inside the region to deal with more with the internal issues and not something to advocate outside to the international community. Right? And CARICOM ministers, heads of state, they have not really used it to that advantage. The only entity that has actually benefited from the CSME is the private sector, without the private sector even being a major player and party to it. Right? So there's a lot more we could talk about that.
Yeah, we're going to talk.
Right?
Yeah, sure. And I saw a hand from her. Please speak in the mic. Quickly.
Hi, everyone. My name is Alana Kembabas with the Initiative for Social and Economic Rights. And I wanted to echo what Adrian said, which is until we begin to rethink this financial architecture, and he gave very concrete proposals, I don't see how we get out of it. In Uganda and many African countries, we've been really grappling. You've heard about the recent call for debt for nature swap. That shows you how desperate we are. And I don't know that we are learning the lessons. I know the IMF is talking about the RST. I think it's a little drop in the ocean, and we are looking to you for you to have more concrete measures getting us out of this crisis. At ISA, we coordinate an Africa coalition and public services in Africa. And part of why this, I think we still don't understand the intertwining of this, is that we know that the climate crisis, for example, has increased government demand to provide, government need to provide social protection, but the debt crisis is stripping those resources at the same time. And the climate finance discussions are isolated from social protection. So we really need you all to get back to the basics on this. And I think a key part of that is listening to us, the people that are often living in these environments where if it rains in my country, you can't go to work in certain areas. It's just completely cut off. Food harvests are failing. And we are still here and teetering around the problem. So again, just to associate myself very strongly with Adrian's calls, and to hope that the IMF would have something more concrete coming up than what you currently offer, because it's not really tackling the heart of what we're facing right now.
Thank you. I believe a lot of answers and solutions can happen when we have a democratic structure, when we have a real governance, just governance system to this global architecture, starting with the IMF. And by here, I thank you for attending. Our audience, thank you. Thanks a lot. Thanks to our esteemed panelists. It was very insightful. And thanks also for my co-organizers, colleagues here for putting the effort to have this panel. And have a good evening.